This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After experiencing trauma, I went to therapy, and my therapist guided me through a difficult time in my life. They helped me understand what was happening and provided me with tools to cope and find my own strength and resilience. Their experience and compassion were invaluable and enabled me to rebuild my life and move forward. I strongly believe in the power of therapy to help people through difficult times. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site. You can use my link, betterhelp.com/resilience. You answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/resilience or choose podcast, then Notes on Resilience during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. Hello, welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky, and my guest today is Jolie Wills of Hummingly. She's a cognitive psychologist and psychosocial expert in disaster and disruption, and we talk about supporting psychosocial recovery after a disaster, the triple responsibility of resilience, and the importance of building a real culture of caring in your organization. I had such a fabulous time talking with Jolie. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Jolie, I'm so excited to be talking to you today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Manya, very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, before we get into the question of why are you here and why are we talking to each other, I ask all my guests, if you could have any superpower, what would it be?
It would be being able to put a protective force field in around people and communities. So, I work in disasters, so I've seen the fallout of what happens. And if there was anything we could do just to protect and prevent, that would be amazing. So some sort of amazing force field. That's what I'd love to be able to deploy.
I love that, like a giant bubble wrap around everybody. Although I think force field is actually a nicer image than a gigantic bubble wrap.
I do imagine a big bubble of some sort,
Yeah, I can see it. I love it. Thank you in advance for those of us who do experience something difficult. I know how much we would love to have that bubble around us. So thank you for thinking of that. And let's talk about you and your story. Who are you? What do you do? And how is it that you and I are here today talking about trauma and resiliency?
Yeah, and I guess the first hint is in the accent, right? So I have a very southern accent in that I'm from New Zealand. Mm-hmm. And I guess the story that's most relevant starts in New Zealand over a decade ago now. And this is an earthquake trigger warning, just for anyone who has been through something similar, just letting you know that there's stuff about earthquakes coming. So kind of with that spoiler alert, really, we woke up in the middle of the night. So it was a very cold spring evening, 4:00 in the morning. We were woken by a 7.1 magnitude earthquake, and it was incredibly shallow and very close to where we lived. So this is in the South Island of New Zealand, just outside of Christchurch, our third biggest city. So, it's one of those, I grew up in the North Island of New Zealand where earthquakes are really frequent, but it's the small earthquakes. And for me, they were kind of exciting, a little bit like a good thunderstorm,
Okay.
Yeah. But this, when I woke up, I just knew it went from kind of, earthquake to terror within a very split second, in terms of the scale and magnitude of what we were experiencing. And so very different to anything I'd encountered before. And I don't know how my husband and I knew. We just kind of bounced out of the bed and went one to each kid. And we couldn't communicate if we wanted to, just because of the noise and everything else. But the house turned into an obstacle course. So walls, floors, furniture, everything, doors flapping. And we got one to each kid. And we can joke about it now, but it was pretty horrific at the time, because I remember thinking my job in this moment, I went to my daughter, is to make her last moments in life as good as possible, right? It was very much where my head was.
Yeah.
My husband went, a couple of meters, and I'm not very good in feet, so maybe, I don't know, another 8 feet further down the hall into the next next bedroom to my son. And this is what we joke about now, is he was 10 years old at the time. My daughter was 6. But he talks about being as traumatic, for him as the earthquake was, just as difficult was having a good 100 kilos. And I don't know what that is in pounds, but you just imagine a really big rugby player.
Yes.
Flying into the room and then landing on top of him, bracing himself on top of him on the bed. So, there's some things that we can joke about, right, as a result. But for us, that was just the beginning of a very long recovery journey for the city of Christchurch, friends, family, community, everybody in it. So that's kind of the how it all started.
Mm-hmm.
But I found myself leading a team looking at, I'm a cognitive scientist, so looking at how we can support the psychosocial recovery of people in Christchurch. So we had everything from loved ones who lost people dear to them and one of the aftershocks. So it didn't happen in the first earthquake. We lost lives, in one of the aftershocks that followed.
Wow.
Through to supporting the entire population with the stress of rebuilding the entire city. And we had 15,000 aftershocks over the period of 5 years. So that constant sense of threat and danger. And as I said, it was one of the aftershocks that claimed 185 lives. So that sense of danger was very real for people. So I guess how we came to be connected is that, I was leading this team and you had the leader being me, affected by the disaster and under a lot of pressure, supporting a team of people who were affected by the event themselves, also under pressure, who were then supporting a community that was under pressure. And we just knew we needed to find a way to be able to support this team as best we possibly could so they could sustain their work, because we knew it wasn't going to be weeks, it wasn't going to be months, it was going to be years that we needed them to be able to work under pressure for.
Yes.
And so we threw everything we could think of at this team to really support them. And the reality was nothing was working. All the normal wellbeing strategies and approaches just weren't cutting it in the kind of pressured environment we were facing, and we were seeing people burning out. Mm-hmm. And itself led to a Winston Churchill research. Mm-hmm. So I was really lucky to get this fellowship, which meant that I could travel around the globe looking at teams working under pressure and understanding what are the impacts of that and how can we do that better and differently. And that led to a design challenge, right? How do we prevent burnout? How do we reduce turnover? How do we support performance under pressure? How do we really support team cohesion? And of course, all of these things, you do not need to be facing a disaster for your teams and the people you work with to be experiencing pressure of this kind.
Right.
So that led to Hummingly, which is an organization I'm a co-founder of, bringing together all of that knowledge that we desperately needed and now realize that actually teams and leaders everywhere can really benefit, from workshops that really help their people perform under pressure in a way that doesn't burn them out.
Right. Wow. Thank you for sharing that story. The earthquake sounds incredibly intense, and I appreciate you being willing to share the difficult parts of your story. I remember seeing it on the news and remember thinking, that doesn't sound great, but it's so different to get the perspective of someone who's there. And I really appreciate your point about you were in a position to be helping people, but you were also stressed and traumatized, and your team was stressed and traumatized. So how do you perform and help while you yourself are struggling with the very same things you're trying to help other people with? Now, can you remind me, were you in the field of disasters or resiliency or anything kind of related to that before the earthquake? What led you in that direction after the earthquake?
Yeah. So not in the field of disasters per se. So I'm a cognitive scientist and I worked in the health sector, in the community support sector in various forms. So think mental health for a time, and then the disability sector, and then the older person sector. So very much looking at community support and health prior to the event. At the time, I was on the local government's board for Red Cross. And so, as you do, stepped in to support, especially, as we were doing work with community members, and particularly where the disasters often don't just happen on a blank slate. Like, we have this feeling that disasters happen to people and we forget that people already have things going on in their lives, right?
Yeah.
So I would be called in if there was a tricky situation in terms of, multiple layers of trauma for somebody, or if they had other particular needs that. So I'd be called in, I'd be supporting and helping through the response phase, so the initial relief period. And then my co-founder, Elizabeth, I happened to meet at this time. She was brought in to really look at This was maybe one of the first disasters in New Zealand where a really long-scale recovery program was going to be needed, not just about supporting in the first weeks and months, but actually how are we going to support the city to rebuild over a period of 5 years or more.
Right.
And so she was looking at how do we need to do that. And I remember having a conversation with her around, this is what we're seeing now, and this is what our support looks like now. But into the long run, we're going to need to be doing X, Y, and Z. And then she said, you've got a job, which is absolutely not what I had signed up for. And we've worked together ever since. So my background wasn't in disasters. It was in cognitive psychology.
Okay.
But Elizabeth, her career has been a series of disasters. So for many years prior, everything from, we call it the Boxing Day tsunami in New Zealand. I think you call it the East Indian Ocean tsunami here. Yes. So, that huge event in 2004 through to other disasters along the way. So Christchurch was one of her string of disasters that just happened to be my home city. So,
wow. Your career before this, or what you focused on before this, wasn't all that different. You were just kind of shifting the focus of what you were doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And learning a lot as I was doing it at high speed.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is what is my relationship with disaster is a little bit different than yours, but the idea of you have to learn a lot quickly in order to deal with what's happening. I completely get that. And I appreciate you mentioning that a disaster doesn't happen on a blank slate, that people's lives are in all different places. And I remember, just share a quick personal story. After the bombing, which was almost 10 years ago as we're recording this, I was talking to a victim advocate and was under the impression that I was the only one who was feeling the way that I was feeling. So I know that differently now. But at the time, I thought, well, I probably need help because I'd been to a therapist before. So that meant there was something wrong with me that meant I couldn't get better. And the victim advocate, who was absolutely wonderful, said, everybody has something going on right now. Everybody has something that they brought with them.
Yes.
Depending on where they are in their life. So no, that's not, you're not unique in that factor. And I thought, oh yeah, of course. Why would I be?
Yeah, absolutely not. And it's such an important thing to learn as you go, because we're so hard on ourselves.
Yes. I think we,
especially as the pressure wears on, and we're like, why are we not reacting or coping the way we think we should or think we would, right?
Yes.
And actually the way that you're reacting and coping is very normal considering what it is you've experienced and gone through. But if you don't know that, it's a very lonely place to be and a lot of self-flagellation involved, right?
Yes.
So the relief that you see, just that weight come off people's shoulders when they realize, gosh, I'm not alone in this. And actually this is very normal reactions to a very abnormal situation. And, I'm having a tough time, but, I'm doing okay. There are other people who are in this with me. And I'm not alone with it. Yeah.
I hope that this podcast and other people I know who do similar work, I hope that we're all helping spread that message that it's normal to feel distressed after something abnormal. I think personally, I was quite surprised to realize that I didn't realize that. Once somebody said, oh, it's normal to be distressed, I thought, well, yes, now that you say that, that makes sense. But it wasn't something I had experienced or seen around me. And resiliency was not a word that I really used before this happened to me. So I'm curious, what do you think about the word resiliency?
Well, I have to separate it from, in Christchurch, we had the earthquakes and then the 15,000 aftershocks. Yeah. Then we had mosque shootings, which were pretty horrific in New Zealand history, and all in Christchurch, which also triggered a lot of but not being able to get to your kids after an event which happened after the earthquakes. So that happened on a very raw population, followed by COVID. I think there was a point a very long time ago in New Zealand, in Christchurch, where Cantabrians, which is what we call locals, Christchurch, the province being Canterbury, people just said, please, no more using the word resilience. We are just over having to be resilient. So I have to separate it from that gut feeling of, do we have to be resilient for longer?
Yes.
But when I get to the core of what resiliency means, it's about, people talk about bouncing back after something has happened, some adverse thing. And I struggle with that for two reasons. I mean, one, to me, the concept of resiliency is very near, dear and important, but I struggle with the bouncing because often, resiliency looks like hanging on by your fingernails sometimes.
Yes.
There's not a lot of bouncing involved. And I think that's normal and okay. And just for people to know that. And I think the bouncing back, I don't think we very often go back to the person we were before.
Yes.
And so resiliency, a very core concept that I am a huge fan and believer in, but just what it looks like is often misconstrued and how it feels.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I relate to the holding on by your fingernails comment. And I also appreciate you mentioning that it doesn't necessarily mean getting back to who you were before.
Yes.
Which I think I certainly was expecting in my own case, to just sort of, let me just fix this and go back to the way things were before.
Yeah.
Given the work that you do and your focus on community and sort of that large scale response, what do you think is the role of our systems or our institutions in helping people heal from a trauma and build on their own resilience?
Yeah, it's such a great question because we often don't think about the systemic piece. We just think it's about self-care and healing at an individual level. And I think that systemic piece is really, really important. And I would say, from that research that we did, that became very clear. So we talk about triple responsibility. So at the individual level, right, we do have a lot of power and control over the things that we can do to support our resiliency, to support healing, to support things that we need to and can put in place for ourselves as individuals. But the reality is, you can have the most resilient of people, most capable of people, practicing incredible self-care and all of these, being very diligent with all of these things. But we can break that person if we load them up with too much for too long. So, so that individual piece. And maybe if I tell a story to illustrate that.
Please do,
Yeah, one of the people I interviewed was a lady who'd been through, they call it bushfires in Australia. So wildfires, a really significant wildfire in Australia. And it had decimated the town in which she lived, and with huge loss of life. It was a really significant event called the Black Saturday bushfires. And she was working for a local government at the time, and I remember saying to her, she was 3 years in, I said, how do you articulate why this is still so hard now to people who just are asking you, aren't you over it yet?
Yes.
Yeah. And she said, well, the way I describe it is it's like carrying this increasing load of bricks. She said, you've got some bricks that were already on your plate before the event. So those are those things that we're talking about. We're not a blank slate, right? Yeah. And often people have a pretty full plate. She said, I had kids, concerns with them, family logistics, your financial concerns, other things that might have happened in her life, aging parents. My role's not always easy. There's never enough resources to be doing what needs to be done. We've got some tricky community members. There's some team dynamics. I mean, there was stuff that she was, she's fine. She said, I was carrying this load that felt like a full plate, but it was okay. Yeah. And then the event came along, the wildfires, and she said every brick that she had in terms of every role that she played suddenly tripled in size and weight. And everything became so much harder, more complicated, difficult. She was having to innovate and solve problems on every front, and the overwhelming sense of need that she was dealing with. And she said, but in my mind, it was like, gosh, this is a heavy load, but this is looking around, everyone's in the same boat. I'm just going to have to suck it up and find a way to manage it, And she said, I thought I could. I'm a pretty capable, strong person. And she said, and I was dealing with this load and I just expected it to lessen. She said, but what seemed to happen over time is that those bricks didn't disappear. Jim over there was having a hard time with his load. And so I ended up with some of his bricks because I'm the safe pair of hands. And so over time, I'd set myself up to manage this huge load, thinking it was for a short little run. And it turned into a really long time. And this is the individual piece that I was and then the systemic piece. She said, then for me, the breaking point was when my manager came to me and said, hey, Anne, I can see you've got a huge amount on your plate. I really hope you're practicing self-care. This is really, really important. But I need you to do these 3 more urgent things by the end of the week and chuck 3 more bricks on, Yes. So just in terms of thinking that systemic piece is understanding that, yes, we need to give people the tools and the support so that they can do things for themselves at an individual level. But at the organizational level, there's a lot that we need to be doing. And it came out really clearly from the research at that systemic organizational level to be able to help manage some of those stressors, to be able to put in place some measures for for people at that systemic level. In between, there's a team piece, which is a whole nother conversation, but that triple responsibility. Yeah.
Wow. I thought about the double responsibility, personal and systemic, but not even that team piece, which maybe in another conversation we can delve deep into that, because I know how important that is. Can you share a little bit more about that research that you're talking about? I find that really interesting and want to share some of those key findings with our listeners.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first thing I wanted to know was, were we alone in the impacts that we were seeing in our people? And of course, the answer was no. So I was looking at what are the impacts of working under prolonged pressure and what are things we can do differently and better, right? And when it came to the impacts, it was incredibly sobering. Like, it was everything right through to physical health declining, memory, mental health, people just feeling totally disorientated in their life, impacted quality of life, careers, what it meant for people in their careers, right through to suicide. So in terms of the impacts of people and what happens to people working under prolonged pressure, it is incredibly physically and psychologically hazardous, So I think that became really clear to me. And I can put up on a screen a whole host of these impacts that came through from the research. And behind every single point, I can hear people's stories around what that looked like for them and their colleagues. Yeah. So incredibly sobering. And for me, I just think I highlight this because if we had someone working up on scaffolding, someone working at heights, it's an incredibly hazardous thing.
Yes.
But we can easily imagine in our mind what happens if we get that wrong, right? And what could happen to that person.
Right.
But I don't think it's as crystal clear in our minds, the link between working under prolonged pressure in this hazardous environment and what can happen to our people if we don't have the right supports in place. And it's not just to our people, it's also the impacts on organizations, right through to being incredibly crippling to an organization in terms of burnout, turnover, reputational risk, service delivery, impact on mission, all sorts of things in terms of, looked at the organizational piece as well. But the thing that was really encouraging from the research, that is if we put the right supports in place, and if we learn some of these lessons from, all those things that we were looking for, like how do we do this better and differently, then it's a really fine line between damage and growth. So if we really support people to do this well, the right knowledge, tools and supports in place, it can be the best fodder. Working under pressure can be the best for personal and professional growth for our people and their careers, for our leaders and for our organizations. So to me, that was really exciting. Yeah.
Wow. I'm so thrilled to hear about this research. It's the kinds of questions that I've had as well. So it's interesting to see the suppositions that I had have been supported by data.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm sure the answer to this question is more complex than we have time for, but what can an organization or our society or our system, however we want to describe it, what can they do to really position people for success after trauma?
Yeah. Again, it would be looking at those three different levels. Like, have we given people the tools to be able to self-support in whatever way they can, so that they have, a little bit of power and control at their own level. And we developed some of the tools for that because we couldn't find what we needed. And we call that sort of PPE, really, personal protective. It's hazardous. So, making sure they've got the training, the personal, protective equipment, the tools that they need to put in place.
Oh, I like
it's
that.
Then looking at teams and really developing an understanding within a team of what each person looks like when the pressure's on and what each person needs, and changing the conversation around, again, the cognitive science of this. The impact on stress on performance is really, really clear, with the beautiful green sweet spot if we get that right? And then this terrible set of impacts if we go on for too long or it gets too much that I talked about before. So ensuring teams have got that training and have those right conversations and have an understanding in place around how to support each other when the pressure's on. Because I don't know about you, Manya, but I've seen and encountered teams that are incredibly toxic and undermine each other's well-being. And this often happens when people have been through incredible stress and they're worn thin and fatigue is set in, and we're not operating as our best selves, when we're really tired. And so teams can really undermine each other's well-being, or on the flip side, they can be the most amazing support to each other. So it's about flicking that switch so that teams have what they need to be a really great support to each other. And we often forget about that piece of the puzzle. And then the third piece being the organizational. What are the stressors that we can address, that we have influence over? What are a whole lot of things around culture and putting in place some of the leadership learnings from crisis.
Right.
Yeah.
I imagine with the types of people and organizations that you work with, what are you seeing as some of the hurdles to get organizations to understand just the premise of what you're talking about?
Yeah. We have occasionally come across organizations who say, oh, it's a personal responsibility, this wellbeing resilience stuff, right? And again, just have to go back to Anne's story with her bricks to understand that's not really how it's worked. It's both, right? And I'd say all three, again, going back to that triple responsibility. The other thing I think is maybe not having the clarity in mind of the link between that working under pressure and the potential risks. So that not being super clear and as obvious to us as, again, some of those, if you had someone driving heavy machinery or like in other circumstances, I think it's much clearer. So it feels a lot more, I don't know what the word is, amorphous. It's a lot harder to be able to say, here's the return on investment. In speaking to these leaders, they often talked about three different things. One is people put the supports in place because the business case stacks up, and it does, or they put the supports in place to manage risk. Okay. So the risk to their organization, it's really hard to recruit people when you get a reputation for burning people out or harming people in the process, or for some of the things the poor decisions that then happen because of short-term thinking due to stress, all of those things, right? Yes. So, and then thirdly, and hopefully the one that we would hope is the biggest motivator, is it's the right thing to do. Yes. Yeah. In terms of for our people.
And I know some organizations, and I'm sure you do too, that the right thing to do is not a good enough argument for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder what it's like working for those organizations or being part of that community when I would imagine some really basic supports are not in place for people.
Yeah. What's fascinating to me, we worked with, and it was a fertilizer company in New Zealand. So, quite a surprising client for us, but they were working in a changing, very disrupted sector and wanted some help supporting. They were seeing some impacts on their customer facing staff who were dealing with stressed farmers, and they working in this very uncertain environment. And they said, actually, a lot of the wellbeing resiliency approaches just do not seem to fit where we're at. But surprisingly enough, you've gone through massive disruption and disaster. What you do seems to be a better fit. And what was interesting for me was going into thinking, okay, this is, the agricultural sector, wellbeing resiliency is not part of their language. It's not, normally high on a priority, I would have thought, And in having these conversations, the leader that we're working with said, we are very far behind, probably other organisations in New Zealand in terms of thinking about wellbeing and resiliency. And when I spoke to their people, and we did a lot of, consultation and work through our trainings, it actually became really clear that you can have the lingo and you can have some processes and some resources, but unless you have this culture of caring for your people, it's very meaningless. And what this organization had was the culture of caring for their people. And their people always knew that if something went down or something happened, this organization had their back and were there to step up and support. And they won Employer of the Year. Following year, we ran, a lot of this training, but they came from a good base of caring about their people. And their turnover rate is so small compared to many other. You could give all the economic reasons why that is a good thing.
Right.
But people just loved to work there. And to be cared about. So it was really interesting to have this organization say, we're not good at this stuff. We don't, actually, they care about their people and they do the right thing for their people. And that really played out both in terms of the performance of their people, but the loyalty of their people to their organization. Yeah. So all the economic benefits stacked up, but,
Right. But that's not how they were.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
It's so interesting. I like what you said about they didn't necessarily have the language of resiliency or the way that perhaps you or I might speak about it, but that culture of caring. And that is the basis for, I think if you don't care about your people, then resiliency is not something you're going to think about.
Yeah.
So it's neat to hear that they had that culture. They just didn't really quite realize that they had set the foundation for building a resilient organization.
So then being able to put the tools and training in place was easy, because it really fell on fertile ground, so to speak.
Yeah, so pun intended.
Yes, for sure.
So what is the most important lesson about resilience that you feel like you've learned because of your work or your experience, your personal experience?
I think for me, I'm a type A striver type person, and always wanted to be seen as capable and I was always that safe pair of hands. So probably a lot like Anne and her story, right? Yeah. So I learned, I talk about the expectation wagon, and one of the things we often don't talk about is the growth that comes after trauma, right? Mm-hmm. And that can be so hard won, and it can be hard talking about growth when people are down in the pit. Yes. But just to know that when you're down and things are really difficult, that for most people, growth still is on the agenda and still likely to come, right? Mm-hmm. So to know that. But part of my growth was, I call it ditching the expectation wagon and managing the superhero curse. So for me, it was that idea that when you prove yourself to be capable at something, especially when everyone's under strain and pressure, you just end up attracting more and more and more until it just becomes unsustainable, much like Anne and her bricks. And I very much have encountered that in my career many a time. And I think when you are working after disaster, you're affected by it. You've got every system, process, your family, through your community to your workplace. Everything is super stretched. You just hit a breaking point. You just hit your limit. Mm-hmm. And I remember having this realization that my time and energy is finite, which is just ridiculous because, of course, it's finite. But I've just been operating as if it was infinite, that I could just keep finding more.
Yes.
And I think when I suddenly had that epiphany that if my time and energy is finite, then I need to be much better at working out where to best apply it, So it became not selfish to say no. It was much more around what is really important in terms of the roles that I need to play, in terms of the people that I need to support, in terms of the things that I want to achieve and contribute to. What is most important? And then finding a way to divvy up my time and energy to support those things and be much more effective rather than feeling like you couldn't do anything very well at all, which is a horrible feeling when you're so spread thin.
Yes.
And so for me, it was just learning my time and energy is finite. I need to ditch some of that expectation wagon. I don't know about you, Manu, but I was brought up to be pretty obliging, part of my social conditioning, and to say yes and to be much more intentional about putting my time and energy as a finite resource that I want to have the best impact I possibly can with it.
Yeah.
For me, I think that was my learning. Came the hard way, but it was, for sure.
I think for many of us, that learning came the hard way, but it makes sense when you finally get to that point to realize that our time is finite and what is the best use of that time.
Yes, absolutely.
So we are getting very close to the end of this conversation. And I wonder, what is one question that you wish I had asked you, and how would you answer it?
Maybe the best piece of advice that I was given on that research trip.
Okay.
If you're up for another story.
I'd love it. Bring it on.
So, and again, an Australian, you have to understand New Zealanders and Australians are kind of like brother and sister with this rivalry, So I wish I was giving you more New Zealand gems. But this another, I have a very, very dear Australian friend who is a phenomenal recovery leader. And she was a great support to me because, we felt that moral obligation to do the best we possibly could in the roles that we had after the earthquakes. And hence, going looking for advice, wisdom from leaders across the world. We were doing whatever we could to soak up some of that advice, wisdom, create the resources that we needed, all of these things that are useful to others now. But Dr. Kate Brady is her name, and she was a great support to us through this time. And she told me a story, and she clearly told me a story for a reason.
Okay.
That superhero curse expectation wagon, you'll get a sense as to why that reason probably was, right?
Okay.
So what she said to me is she said, Jolie, I'm going to tell you a story. And she said it happened early in my career. She trained as a social worker.
Okay.
And she went to one of her first professional interviews. She was pretty excited. She said, I was hitting it out of the park, Jolie. I was answering all the questions, nail on the head. Like I was like, this is going great. And she said, and then the hiring manager asked her a question she just didn't know what to do with. And the question was, so Kate, are you a martyr or are you a professional? And Kate's like, I don't know how to answer that. Are you a martyr or are you a professional? Kate's like, I'm not quite. And she said, well, it's quite simple, really. Mm-hmm. If you're a martyr, you will be the first one here. You'll be the last one to leave. You will always say yes. You will fill every gap in my roster. You will be so obliging, when you should probably be going home to get some rest. There'll be just no boundaries in place, and you will be amazing, Kate. We will do incredible things for 2 or 3 months, maybe a bit longer.
Yes.
But if you're a professional, you will sometimes push back and say no and put some boundaries in place. You will role model self-care for others. And you will understand that by doing so, you and I will work together for a whole lot longer, and it's well worth me investing in professional development in you. And we're going to do some great things in the long run with greater impact than what you will if you burn bright but burn out pretty in a short time. In which case, there's no point me investing in you in professional supervision. But I'll fill every gap in the roster if that's how you choose to be. I'd just rather you're a professional. Wow. Which are you, Kate? Are you a professional or are you a martyr? So that's one of the stories we tell in our training, and it's stuck with me. And I can quite readily admit I'm a recovering martyr, So that for me, I think is especially when people are working under pressure and gone through a lot, been through something, carrying a huge lot of bricks. Yes. It's that we're not very good at asking for the support that we need. We're very good at giving it. Yes. And there's something about hardship and adversity that teaches us some grace and it going both ways.
Wow. That's a great question. Thank you for asking and answering that one. I appreciate it. So what would you tell your 18-year-old self about resiliency?
Yeah, I would say, and I'm going back in my head to some of these years after the earthquakes, but I would say to my 18-year-old self, if you're finding it hard, you're not alone. But like we talked about before, that actually it's not you. It's not that you're weak. It's not that, stop berating yourself. Mm-hmm. So you're not alone, that this is very normal in terms of the reactions that you might be experiencing and how you might be feeling. So you are stronger than you think. And it doesn't mean that actually feeling that way, it doesn't mean that you're not. Yeah. So you're not alone, and don't do it alone, I would say would be my 2 things. Yeah.
That's adding on the don't do it alone, because for most things you do not have to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, Jolie, this has been fabulous, and I could continue for days having our conversations, and hopefully we are going to do that offline. But how can our listeners reach you?
Yeah, so they can reach me on LinkedIn. You'll find me Jolie Wills, so Jolie, and Wills, Wills, or Hummingly, so hummingly.co, hummingly.co. Yeah, is the other way you can find us.
Excellent. We'll put links in the show notes so everybody can find you. And Jolie, thank you so much. I really very much enjoyed talking with you.
I did too. It's a real pleasure. Thanks very much, Manya.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for listening. I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. So if you'd like to learn more about me, Manya Chilinsky, I work with organizations to help understand how to create environments where people can thrive after difficult life experiences. And I do this through talks and consulting. I'm a survivor of mass violence, and I use my experience to help leaders learn about resiliency, compassion, and trauma-sensitive leadership, to build strategies to enable teams to thrive and be engaged amidst difficulty and turmoil. If this is something you want to learn more about, visit my website, www.manyachilinsky.com, or email me at manya@manyachilinsky, or stop by my social media on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much.